Good morning and welcome to Saipan in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands here in the beautiful Northern Pacific, where I'm working for the next couple of months, and I'm very excited to be here. Of course, I've been doing the video lectures for you, and I hope that those have been helpful and you've been able to enjoy those. And so what we need to do here today, since we're sitting on this beautiful beach on a beautiful morning here, is we need to go ahead and do a review now that you have all the lectures, and I thought it would be kind of fun to do it from the ocean side here, enjoying the beautiful views behind us. Alright, so as you know, you have a final exam coming up. The final exam is going to be 50 questions, and they're going to be multiple choice questions, so very similar to the midterm exam, okay? So what are the things that you need to know? So I've broken them down by topic in terms of the chapters that we've covered. So we'll just go through this really quick, and then I can upload it to YouTube, and you can actually begin your preparations for the final exam now. Alright, so you probably remember we had the chapter on defense mechanisms, okay? What are the defense mechanisms that you need to know, okay? You need to remember and recognize regression, okay? So what I'll do is I'll give you a clinical caveat. So in other words, I'll give you a presentation of a patient who is exhibiting one of the defense mechanisms, and you'll need to go ahead and recognize regression, all right? Remember, regression is when we regress to a previous developmental state so that we don't have to deal with the pressures in our current life. And I think there's two questions on regression. You'll also need to answer a question about rationalization, okay? Remember, rationalization is when we try to rationalize the situation that we're in. So you take somebody that, you know, they've wanted to go to Harvard their whole life, and they worked hard, and they got good grades, and they had extracurricular activities, and then what happens? They weren't accepted to Harvard. So what do? They rationalize it. They go, oh, I didn't want to go to Harvard anyway. Now I can pursue my dream of going to community college and, you know, following something like that. So regression, rationalization. You'll also need to do intellectualization. So remember, intellectualization is when we take something that's difficult. Well, all the defense mechanisms are taking something that's difficult and trying to deal with them emotionally. And so with intellectualization, we take a difficult situation and we see it not as we would normally expect to see it, with flawed emotions that humans exhibit, but we see it from an intellectual standpoint. So you know, a molecular biologist is diagnosed with cancer, and so instead of getting upset and saying, oh my gosh, my life is over, you know, he thinks about it from the standpoint of, well, what's going on with the molecules in my cells right now, and what is the cancer doing, okay? So once again, it's a way of not dealing with the situation. And of course, then we have denial. Remember, with denial, it's, you got this nice little happy bubble that you live in, and nobody's going to puncture that bubble. And denial is perhaps the most difficult one to deal with, because how do you treat a patient that completely denies that they have a problem? So that's the defense mechanisms, regression, rationalization, intellectualization, and denial. All right, then we did a lecture on alcohol and substance abuse, and I hope you enjoyed that. And we put a large emphasis there in terms of you as a provider recognizing the risks of alcohol abuse, both in yourself and in your colleagues. Okay, and the one thing that you need to know for the exam, well, not the one thing, there's a couple of things, is go back and read the notes and listen to my lectures and look for the screening tool that we use to screen people for alcohol abuse. And I'll just tell you right now, it's CAGE, C-A-G-E. So go back and review that. Go back and review in the notes about the employment status of most alcoholics, and that has to do with, you know, the fact that we underdiagnose and we underscreen people, because in fact most alcoholics are employed, okay? Then go back and review the notes in terms of the most commonly abused substance in early adulthood, in the teenage years, and why that is, okay? Then you need to go back and listen to the portion of the lecture that deals with FAS, or fetal alcohol syndrome, okay, and develop an understanding between the connection between FAS and alcohol consumption, okay? Then you remember we had a large chunk of the lecture where we dealt with pharmacological treatments for alcohol abuse, so I want you to go back. The three I want you to understand is naltrexone, acamprosate, okay, and lorazepam, okay? And the same thing, I'll give you a clinical caveat and I'll describe how the patient is being treated with one of these drugs, and the impact of the drug, and you'll need to be able to recognize it from that standpoint. Remember, the idea with the naltrexone is it makes the alcohol taste like crap, okay? The idea with the acamprostate was we talked about the glutamate receptors, those excitatory neurons, okay? And so the acamprostate actually reduces the action of the glutamate receptors, so it lowers the excitatory response that we get from the alcohol. And then remember, the idea with the lorazepam is it deals with the seizures and the hallucinations that come with alcohol and alcohol withdrawal, okay? Then we go all the way back to the beginning of the semester, and we had that initial lecture where we talked a lot about research methodologies. So make sure you can go back, and if I give you a study design, you can recognize the independent and the dependent variables, and I think you did that on the midterm, so you should be good to go with that. There's a couple of questions on that. You need to go back and review the portion of the notes that deals with the behavior, all right, and the role that behavior plays as an unconscious drive in gathering data on human behavior, okay? You need to go back and look at the portion that dealt with case studies and develop a definition of case studies. Just like on the midterm, you need to be able to interpret correlation coefficients. Remember, that's the R equals somewhere between -1 to 0 and 0 to +1. So you need to be able to interpret what that means, okay? Our good buddy, the biopsychosocial model, of course, comes into play. So please be able to recognize examples of the biological, the psychological, and the social elements. All right. You also need to be able to recognize a random sample. So remember, a random sample is the idea that everybody in the population has a potential chance of being included, okay? And then you need to go back and develop a definition of a survey. What is a survey? How does a survey gather data? And remember, we talked about the strengths and the weaknesses of a survey. Strengths are that we can gather data on a large number of individuals rapidly. Weaknesses are that a survey is self-reported, and so it's possible for the individual to not give honest responses on that, okay? Then we had our little discussion of the psychiatric disorders. So there's a couple of psychiatric disorders I want you to be able to recognize, and I'll give them to you in a clinical presentation, a clinical caveat, and then I'll say, you know, what psychiatric disorder is the patient exhibiting, and you'll need to be able to choose. So the first one is bipolar disorder. Remember, that's manic depressive. Okay, so go back and review that. Remember, you get the two extremes of behavior. You get the manic that's very excited, I can accomplish anything in this world, I can stay up long periods of time. And then you get the depressive side of the disorder, in which they feel like life is worthless and they're depressed, and they, you know, sometimes they even want to consider suicide. Okay. Go back and look at panic attacks again. Remember, the idea with panic attacks is it simulates a heart attack. Okay, and so one of the big things we talked about with panic attacks is you can't just jump to panic attack as a diagnosis. You have to consider whether or not it truly is a cardiac episode. Once you rule out it being a cardiac episode, then you can go ahead and consider a diagnosis of panic attack. Okay, review obsessive compulsive disorder, not obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but OCD itself. Okay, so remember, OCD is something you develop out of a traumatic event. OCD personality disorder is something you're born with. Okay. Go back and review the information on schizophrenics, in particular with schizophrenics. I want you to review hallucinations and what the most common type of hallucination is in our schizophrenic patients, okay? Go back and review the information on phobia. Don't learn the specific phobias. Just get a generalized definition of phobia and recognize that in a clinical caveat as well. Same thing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, I want you to be able to recognize a PTSD patient. Okay, and then the one that it's not necessarily in the notes. Whoa, the water got real close there. It's not necessarily in the notes, but I want you to recognize the pharmacological action of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We did that on the board. Remember, that's the idea of the presynaptic and the postsynaptic, and they produce that cleft in terms of the neuron. And remember, the SSRI holds the serotonin in that pre and postsynaptic cleft longer, and the serotonin elevates mood. Okay. Then also in the first half of the semester, we talked about lifespan development. That was the lectures that had that really annoying chart that I made you memorize some information off of. Same thing again, you got to go back and do that. Go back and memorize the age at which a child can stack 6 cubes, on top of each other, and the age at which a child can stack 9 cubes on top of each other. Go back and review the difference between endogenous and exogenous smiling so that you can recognize that. Get the age at which a child should have permanent teeth, the age at which a child should be able to walk alone, okay, and the age at which a child can alternate feet going up and down stairs. There was a question on that on the midterm, and I think people had difficulty with it because they didn't realize I was asking both up the stairs and down the stairs, okay? And the last one you need to know from lifespan development is the age at which a child can draw a picture of a person, a figure, all right, with a head and a body and a limbs that are recognizable. So that's everything from lifespan development, okay? And then we have the lecture on behavior, learning, and behavior modification, okay? Go back and find the chunk of the notes that dealt with IQs, okay, and learn when a Stanford-Binet IQ scale would be used, okay? Go back and look at the portion of the notes where we talked about genetic influences on behavior. In particular, I want you to think of that from the standpoint of, remember we talked about the alcohol gene and the idea that it's genes plus environment that causes pathology. So I can have the alcohol gene, all right, but if I don't engage in the environmental influences, in other words, if I don't drink alcohol, then the gene remains inactive and I don't get the pathology. So go back and review that. We talked about reinforcement schedules. So in other words, when do you get the reinforcement? When do you get the, the pat on the back that comes from engaging in a behavior? And the two I want you to know are continuous. So in other words, that means every time you engage in a behavior, you get the pat on the back. Every time you do well on a test, mom and dad give you $5. And then the fixed ratio, okay? So the fixed ratio was we had a specified number of times that we had to do something before we got the specified reward. So maybe mom and dad say, no, you have to get 5 A's this semester, and then we'll give you $100 or something like that. Okay, so those are the two reinforcement schedules, continuous and fixed ratio. Okay. Now, just in terms of types of reinforcement, I want you to go back and review the information on negative reinforcement. So that's where we add in something negative. You do poorly on the test, mom and dad take away your car privileges. I think there's 2 questions on that. And then I want you to, if we're going to talk about negative, obviously there's going to be a question about positive reinforcement where we add something positive in. All right, so remember the difference. The negative reinforcement is we're going to punish you. We're going to add something negative in to get you to stop the behavior. And then the positive is we're going to give you something positive. So think about it like a mathematical operation. We're going to give you something positive to try to get you to continue to engage in the behavior. Okay. Let's see, so you need to recognize immediate reinforcement. So in other words, something is immediately provided to you. So in other words, you go to the vending machine, you get a candy bar, you eat the candy bar, the Twix tastes good. All right, that's immediate reinforcement, okay? The other thing we talked about, some methods for altering behavior and changing behavior. Review the information on biofeedback and how we can use biofeedback to control our internal state as it responds to external stressors. So in other words, like hypertension. I can control my hypertension if I learn what the triggers are and I learn breathing exercises, all right, to lower my internal respiratory state and hence lower my internal cardiovascular state as well. Okay? Then you need to recognize, we talked about punishment, all right, and in particular, remember we talked about how if you've got a kid that's done something wrong, okay, and they've been punished at school, for instance. They had to stay in at recess, or they had to retake an exam, whatever it happens to be. Okay, that punishment is connected in time and space to the event. The kid engaged in the bad behavior at school, so he was punished for the bad behavior at school. Okay, now if we punish the kid at home, or excuse me, at school, and then we also punish the kid at home, the punishment at home is not connected in time and space, and a lot of times with younger children, they don't get that connection. So remember, understand, something happens at school or at work or wherever it happens to be, and a punishment stands there, let it stand there. Don't add an additional punishment that's not connected in time and space at a later time, because that is not effective. okay? And then the final thing I want you to recognize, okay, is classical conditioning. If I give you an example of a patient or an individual who's undergoing classical conditioning, you need to be able to say, hey, this is classical conditioning. And remember, classical conditioning was Pavlov and his dogs. Remember, Pavlov took the dogs and he went from them smelling the food as he was ringing the food and the dogs would salivate to he would ring the bell, all right, and the dogs would learn to associate the ringing of the bell with the provision of the food. So pretty soon the ringing of the bell was all that it took for those dogs to salivate, okay? And then we have some examples of that as they apply to clinical scenarios. I think they dealt with oncology and chemotherapy. Go back and review those as well. Those are excellent examples. So I'll give you a caveat. You got to recognize classical conditioning. And so that's it. You're all ready. 50 multiple choice questions. Very, very similar to the midterm exam. And if you follow the study guide and you do what I'm asking you to do, you will do fabulous as always. So you've been a great group of students. As always, I feel bad that I couldn't be there with you for the whole semester. But as you can see, life ain't too bad. You know, I'm sitting here on the beautiful island of Saipan. I get to go to the beaches. And believe it or not, where I'm sitting right now, my office over at the hospital is only about a half a block away. So life is good in Saipan, but life is good in Fiji as well. So go study for the exam, have a great end of the semester, and please know that even though I don't teach you again in the dental science program and the dentistry program, if you ever need anything in the future, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm certainly happy to be there for you. So have a great day, and as we love to say here in Saipan, hop a day.